Alright, so haven't seen this video, but this guy's basically a commie. Let's get into it.
Account called Milei Explains. And it's called Why Top Economists Are Often Wrong. Now, in principle, Argentinians, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry for you. I mean, he seems, it's, Bolsonaro is replaced and you end up with Javier Milei next door. It's like you can't, Latin America has to have at least one, several, in fact, a quota of absolutely off their nut leaders. But yeah, so let's just see. This is his general vibe, I feel.
El análisis de mercado que tiene que ver con esto que explica tan brillantemente Hazlitt en su libro La economía en una lección, que dice cuál es la diferencia entre el buen economista y el mal economista. Bueno, el mal economista solamente mira un mercado y no tiene en cuenta los efectos sobre otros mercados.
Okay, so it's worth what he's just said, right? Is like, oh, no way, this is peaking this mic now. So what he's just said is that a good economist takes into account all markets, not just one, and that they look at things over time and not just looking at a single snapshot. How many economists, whether mainstream academic economists or economic journalists or economics graduates working in government or private sector economists, people in the tech sector, people in the financial sector, or heterodox economists or Marxist economists, or post-Keynesian economists, or Austrian economists or institutionalists, how many of them do you think don't do that? Like, close enough.
Tons, absolutely tons. Anytime there's discussion of government stimulus, any sort of government spending, they're only looking at the spending itself, not what that could have been. This criticism is absolutely 100% accurate of the mainstream economics profession today.
Enough to zero, right? Of course, almost every economist tries to take into account things that happen over time and things that happen in...
I really don't think he understands the gist of what Milei and actually Bastiat are talking about. This all comes from Bastiat's essay on that which is seen and that which is unseen. And the gist of his argument was, when the government spends and does something, it's easy to see what they did. It's not easy to see what would have resulted if they hadn't done that thing. That is, you can build a hospital or a school or a road, and it's easy to see the good that's caused by that. But you don't see what would have happened, how those funds would have been allocated absent if the state hadn't done that thing.
Different markets, depending on the question. If I'm just studying the automobile market, I might restrict my attention to that, at least in the first step, right? And it could be that the impact on other markets is not big enough for me to bother about in that particular piece of research or article. It's pretty simple, right? What he's saying is he's saying something that he's trying to make sound really deep, but it's not that deep. And one of the things about Henry Hazlitt and Economics in One Lesson, which is like a really big popular thing among YouTubers, well, on YouTube, among libertarians on YouTube, very big online. Economics in One Lesson, by the way, not a text that you will ever reference on a university degree in economics. Like, it's not. It's just not considered like an actual lesson in economics. It's considered a very biased free market lesson in economics. So when someone like Hazlitt or
Hazlitt was an incredible author, self-taught. He wrote for the New York Times, which had a different bent when he was about. Absolutely brilliant mind. He's wrote a number of works aside from Economics in One Lesson. I really enjoyed his The Way to Willpower and The Science of Thinking, which are nonpartisan works. He also wrote a cool fiction story about a dictator who basically tried to keep intervening in the economy, and things got worse. It's parable for economic invention in general. To the degree that academia has not embraced Hazlitt in his thought, which is profound and far-reaching, then that is to their discredit.
Milei says that you should take into account time periods.
But again, this is actually from Hazlitt. He's the original person who identified this very profound and important concept.
In the future, and when you should take into account general equilibrium effects across all markets. When they say that, what they're really saying is the government can't do anything because either over time or in other markets, it's going to have negative spillovers, right? Which affect.
Again, it's not really the negative spillovers, it's what would have happened if this hadn't happened. It's like an alternate world in which, or an alternate timeline in which the government didn't do thing X. Then you see what would have happened naturally.
Which affect things negatively. So when they say the difference between a good and a bad economist, what they're saying is a bad economist calls for government intervention, but doesn't realize that government intervention necessarily results in inferior outcomes. Okay, so that's the reason they're saying it. It's already biased, right? It's not just that they're saying, look across all markets and try to keep time in your head, right? Try to notice that there are years ahead of the current one, because obviously everybody knows that. So what they're doing is biasing it towards like the law of unintended consequences, right? When the government tries to do something good, like raise the minimum wage, oh no, it's going to have negative effects by increasing inflation or creating unemployment. So
raising the minimum wage isn't good. This is a very stupid policy, and it's hard to imagine how anybody with more than a superficial understanding of economics would be in favor of it. You raise the minimum wage, you don't raise anybody's wage, okay? That is what you would think it would do intuitively, but the reality is firms do not have fixed employment schedules, okay? So to break it down very simply, let's imagine there's a factory that produces widgets, and the firm's hiring, they need more workers, so there's Joe, who makes 5 widgets an hour and gets paid $5. He's applying for the job. And there's Brian, who makes 10 widgets an hour and he wants a salary of $10. So the firm is ambivalent about which of these two workers they'll hire because the marginal labor cost per unit produced is the same. They're both getting paid relative to their marginal revenue value product. They're both paid based on their productivity. But if you set the minimum wage at $7 an hour, now the firm has to go with the guy who makes $10 an hour, because otherwise, if they hire Joe and Joe 2, who's identical, because if they want the equal production, you need 2 Joes for one, whatever the guy's name was, then now they're paying $14 an hour because of the $7 minimum wage to get the same productivity that you can get by hiring the guy for $10 an hour. So when the minimum wage goes up, firms firms hire productivity workers that have a productivity that's in line with the new minimum wage, and it prices low skilled workers out of the marketplace. So it's not correct to say everybody's wage went up or minimum wage workers went up. It's instead you have this new group of people who are the worker pool afterwards.
You need to know, but that they're saying this, right?
What are you doing now, bro?
Let's say I robotize my factory to make more money.
Digo, yo robotizo mi planta. Bueno, para algo lo hago para ganar plata de vuelta. Ahora, ¿qué hago con esa plata? ¿Qué hago con esa plata? La consumo, genero puesto de trabajo en otro lado. Digo, la invierto, creo yo, puesto de trabajo y me...
Okay, so this example isn't even like a free market example. It's just a really weird one. So I robotize my factory and make a lot more money. But okay, what if you robotize your factory and then the entire industry robotizes their factories and then costs fall and competition drives the price down and you don't make money so that you can't invest or consume it? What if you do make money but you just don't invest or consume it, right? Like when you spend money, okay, so also this is a mess, right? I think the point gets away from him here, by the way. So this is a mess because if I invest it, I'll create jobs myself, right? Okay, but he's just said that he's destroyed jobs by automating. So, I mean, is he starting a new factory here?
Puesto de trabajo y mejoro la calidad.
And improve the quality and price of goods. So, I mean, it's just like assuming that he makes money from robotizing the factory, which isn't necessarily given, and it's just assuming that he invests.
Yes, factory owners reinvesting profits is a good thing economically. That's how we have capital accumulation. That's how we have more productive workers. That's how we have a more productive society. Savings and investment are a cornerstone of economic growth. But really, I think what Milei is saying is that basically all outcomes are good. So there can be some negative things, like you automate and workers are laid off, but that's not the end of the story. Okay, you have to see the seen and then you have to see the unseen. You know, people are very concerned about automation and they're worried that it's going to kill jobs, but the reality is, you know, we've been using capital to make labor more productive for hundreds of years, and working conditions, employment have only gotten better. So there's really nothing to be afraid of.
She may well not do, right?
Y el precio de los bienes y le mejoro la vida a todos porque además tiene más plata para gastar en otras cosas. Digamos, la ahorro y convierto, eso se convierte.
Okay, so again, if I save it banking, that becomes an investment somewhere else. That's not true, right? Like it's really the case if you. Okay, so firstly, you can save without putting into a bank, right?
Sure, but he's explicitly saying I save it in a bank. That's what the brackets banking says.
And there is this massive misconception that when you save money, that necessarily results in investment. And I think that the problem here is that the words saving and investment are used in the wrong...
It's not so much that savings necessarily leads to investment. You can save so you consume down the road. It's that you can't invest without savings. You must first save and then you can invest. But in this case, where he's talking about you save it in a bank, then the bank is going to invest that for you, or for themselves rather. That's how modern banks work. You deposit your funds and they invest them, they loan them out.
In the wrong cases, right? People use them in multiple different cases and they assume they're interchangeable when actually in different cases they mean different things. On aggregate, savings in the macroeconomic income identities, that actually just means investment, right? It actually just means like investing money in capital goods and putting them aside. That's what saving is as a component of income at a macroeconomic level. It actually has very little to do with putting money aside. Now, if you put money into a bank, you improve their position, right? You improve their capital position, okay? But that doesn't necessarily result in more lending. If banks want to lend money, then they can, and they'll be accommodated by central banks or potentially by other market forces.
Sure, but the greater the pool of loanable funds, everything else being equal, the cheaper it will be to borrow. So savings does facilitate investment. In fact, that's how an interest rate would be set on the free market if there was no central bank. It would be the degree of consumer savings versus the demand to borrow money. Besides the fact that the modern banking system isn't actually reliant or necessarily directly reliant upon savings for investment, is really an indictment of the modern banking system. That is to say, the credit expansion, the inflationary credit expansion caused by fractional reserve banking and the central bank is the ultimate root source of the business cycle. For example, in the lead up to the Great Depression, 1920 to 1929, there was a lessening of the reserve requirements and considerable expansion of the money supply through bank credit expansion, through loans to businesses from commercial banks. That's what ultimately caused the Great Depression, because the malinvestment caused by this credit expansion ultimately had to be liquidated, and it was liquidated in the sudden crash. And then, of course, FDR's policies and Hoover's policies greatly prolonged the misery.
Sorry, yeah. My window's in the way. I'll put myself up here, right? So it's worth saying, right? So what started this is that it's a really weird example, but he's just automated away a load of jobs in a factory, right? And he isn't really talking about the workers that this happened to.
That's the whole point. You have to see the seen as well as the unseen. Yes, there's the seen. The workers lost the jobs. However, there's the unseen. Those workers end up working somewhere else. The factory now has lower expenses on a monthly basis. Let's say this guy's right and other factories do the same thing and bring the cost down to consumers. That's an additional benefit. Now the price is lower for the consumers.
Which is just like a massive oversight, right? He says he's talking about all markets, but he's not. Yeah, so yeah, he doesn't mention the entire sector's worth of income that was just lost. Yeah, robotizing causes people to lose jobs. Yeah, anyway. So this just doesn't follow. And he's not engaging with when people complain about automation. He's not engaging with the main point they make, which is that people lose their jobs. Although maybe he does in a second.
Mirá que puedo llegar a ser tan perverso, tan complicado como ser humano, que la hundo en la tierra. Hago desaparecer ese dinero. ¿Sabes qué? Digamos, se achica la cantidad de dinero, la economía, el nivel de precios es más bajo, digo, se beneficia entre toda la población y beneficia más a los que son más castigados.
Okay, so again, hello Floyd. Again, this just isn't true, right? If you withdraw money,
of course it's true. Inflation occurs when you print more money. That is, the supply of money increases, so goods become relatively more more expensive. That's why every year you have prices going up, is because the government's pretty much always increasing the money supply, and that's why during the late 19th century in America, prices were going down steadily, because they had a gold standard and they had full reserve banking, and the money supply was not increasing every year. So if you were to completely remove some amount of money from the money supply, yes, that would deflate. It would do the opposite of printing more money. So imagine that overnight the total money supply doubled. That is, whatever cash you had in your pocket doubled. Whatever bank account you had doubled. Okay? Tangible assets didn't double, but all the cash doubles. So what's going to happen is all the prices are going to double because there is a finite amount of wealth available for sale at any given time. So the market should normalize your purchasing power relative to what it used to be. And conversely, if all the money was halved, then all the prices should halve because money is just a medium of exchange. And there's a finite amount of wealth available for sale in a given economy.
Economy, then what can happen is that there's a general demand deficiency and the economy
Say's law. There's no such thing as too much supply or too little demand because supply of X constitutes demand for Y.
reach full employment. Okay, and this does not necessarily result in some kind of fall in prices. It's
Full employment at what price? Whenever people talk about something that's not selling in the market, you have to ask at what price, right? If I were unable to sell steel for 3 years, you might ask, well, what price? And it turns out I'm trying to charge 3 times the market price. Obviously, it's not going to sell. If you sell it at the market price, it's the same quality good, it's going to sell. So there really should be no unemployment in a market economy except voluntary unemployment, which is when somebody could get a job, but they're holding out for something better. They don't want to work at McDonald's. There shouldn't be any involuntary unemployment where somebody's looking for a job, but they can't find anything. But this can result because of government intervention, most noticeably the minimum wage. So if there are barriers to prices falling, then things will not fall. This is basic micro.
if it did result in a fall in prices, that would be a good thing. Deflation is often associated with economic downturns. If everyone's prices and incomes are falling, then there's no reason to
Associated is the right word. Deflation occurs during recessions because the money supply gets contracted. But the deflation isn't a bad thing. It's only the deflation caused the recession. It's the result of the recession. Again, look at the 19th century, the Gilded Age, extremely high economic growth and steady deflation across the board. So you should expect a little healthy deflation if you have a fixed money supply.
going to be the higher quality and lower price goods that he's talking about. That's just not going to happen. Debt burdens, real debt burdens are going to increase, right? If your incomes and prices are falling, then your debts, which are nominal, right, they're just denoted in amounts.
Yeah, and who's the biggest debtor in society? It's the state. That's why they have an inflationary monetary policy, because they want to decrease the value of their debt. Yeah, debt burdens would increase, and creditors would benefit. There would be more incentive to save and to lend. And inflation does the opposite. It rewards debt. It encourages debt. It encourages consumption. It punishes savings.
Of £300,000, that's going to increase, right, relative to your income. So it's not clear that even if this did happen, which it doesn't, by the way, and they've tried it many times.
It would. I mean, first of all, it wouldn't be noticeable probably, unless this guy's like Jeff Bezos and he's borrowing $50 billion, and even then it's probably not noticeable just because there's so much USD in circulation, right? But to the degree that it had an effect at all, it would be a deflationary one.
Out of depression, they did it in the Great Depression, most notably. It didn't work.
That's a lie. At least the Fed actively pursued an expansionist monetary policy during the Great Depression. The issue wasn't inflation during the Great Depression. What is this guy even talking about? So the money supply did fall in 1931, but that wasn't because of the Federal Reserve. That was because the money supply contracted with the bank credit expansion being contracted. If you look at U.S. government securities held by the Fed, and as everyone knows, the way that the Fed tries to increase the money supply is by buying government bonds, you'll see that they massively expanded the amount of government bonds they held. And this is because the credit expansion that occurred during the 1920s wasn't at the behest of the Fed. It was at the behest of private banks. That's where the credit expansion happened, because they lowered the reserve requirements, because the Fed pursued its price stability policies, yes, too. But you can see, you can't see on this graph. But anyway, you can see here, 1930 to 1931, the Fed did everything they can to expand the money supply. They had an expansionist monetary policy. They were not trying to deflate. And why would they? I mean, that's not the theory. The idea is you need to sell government bonds when there's high inflation. But they had deflation at the time. I mean, this guy is really confused on a lot of basic facts.
That even if it did actually happen, that it would think. I just think it just prolongs a downturn. For those affected by inflationary taxes. Footnote: inflationary tax, prices going up non-stop. So prices going up non-stop is just inflation, right?
No, inflation is an increase in the money supply. Prices can go up for any number of reasons, including inflation. Well, what they're saying here is that inflation is a tax. What's a tax? A tax is when the government gets money from people, okay? So why is inflation a tax? Well, why does the government inflate, okay? Let's say instead of the government, it was me inflating it. Okay, I had a little machine where I could print money and I could go spend it at the store. What would happen? I would get very rich, right? I'm printing a lot of money, and I would get very rich. Well, we know that it's not a magic wealth creating machine; it's a magic money creating machine. So that wealth would come at the expense of somebody else, aka everybody else who had any money. I would be siphoning off a tiny little portion of the purchasability of their money, of their purchasing power. So it's the same thing when the government does it. When the central bank creates money out of thin air and uses that money to buy government bonds, and then the government spends that newly created money on whatever they spend money on, okay? That comes at the expense of everybody who has savings. That middle class person who's been dutifully putting away $50, $100 a month because they want to save for retirement and buy a house. They got a savings account at the bank. That inflation is robbing their savings, and since the government's doing it, they're the one taking the money, they're the one getting it, then it's a tax.
Right? Inflation is the rate of change. As long as it's positive, prices go up. But that's not a tax.
I mean, if you want, we can distinguish between price inflation and monetary inflation. But prices can go up or down, based on supply and demand. But prices going up in a whole, inflation is when you increase the money supply, and that's going to increase prices if all else stays equal, because now there's more money relative to the amount of stuff that can be bought. The reason we have inflation every year is because the government engages in expansionary monetary policy, which is very destructive to the economy, but very beneficial to them, as it allows them to devalue their debt, because also they're spending this newly created money, so they're the first people to spend it, so they benefit from Cantillon effects. But it's very difficult for people that are on fixed incomes, for someone who's trying to live off savings.
In fact, based on what we just said, right, about how deflation can be bad, inflation can be good. Inflation is generally a sign of a growing economy.
No, that's wrong. That's completely wrong. So, and again, just look at the Gilded Age, look at the 19th century, when the money supply was stable and the economy was growing very rapidly. You had a deflation of about 1.5% a year, okay? What would a growing economy mean? It would mean more goods and services are being produced relative to the population, which would lead to lower prices. If the supply of goods increases, then everything else being equal, the price is going to decrease. Rising prices are a sign of inflation. They're a sign that the government has been inflating the money supply. Yeah, if the government's not too greedy, if they keep inflation to just 1 or 2% a year, then the effects aren't as bad as when you get the levels like you're seeing in Argentina and in Turkey right now, or levels like we saw hyperinflation in Venezuela or Zimbabwe. But just because the market economy produces so much wealth that it can overcome the government's inflation, so long as inflation is kept mild, doesn't mean that inflation is a good thing, or that inflation is good for the economy, or that a growing economy means higher prices. What a growing economy should mean is lower prices. And in fact, that's what we see, is we see real wages increasing. So in effect, people are enjoying lower prices, but only because wages are outpacing inflation.
Right? And depending on how inflation is distributed, that's the important thing. It can hit people differently, right? So calling inflation a tax, firstly, it's just, making words meaningless, because it's not. But also, it doesn't necessarily affect people negatively. If prices go up by 5% and my income goes up by 5%, that is inflation. That is prices going up non-stop. And also, again, it reduces debt burdens. If my mortgage is, £3,000 a month, then my income going up relative to that is going to reduce my debt burden, right? So that's really.
Yes, inflation benefits debtors. That's the whole point. That's one of the main reasons why the government does it. The government is the largest debtor in society. They have to, at this stage, print away some of that money, debt. And maybe it sounds, okay, let's be egalitarian, let's help out the debtors by printing some money, until you realize, who are these guys that have all this debt? It's not the poor, right? Banks aren't going to loan anything to a poor guy. It's these guys like Donald Trump, that have billions of dollars in debt. That they're the ones who benefit, right? It's these ultra wealthy people that have the assets that can secure large loans for large scale businesses. And who are the people who are saving? It's workers, it's the middle class, people that are dutifully putting away a few bucks here and there. So you got to wonder, who's really benefiting from these policies? And do we want an economy based on consumption, or do we want an economy based on savings and investment? Which is the long-term recipe for health?
People, as long as the inflation isn't run away, and as long as wages and other incomes keep up with inflation. But he's not discussing that, because that would force him.
So that's the other thing, is that the inflation doesn't just go up equally, as he said. So different people are affected at different rates depending what they're spending their money on. What happens is the newly created money sort of oozes out into the economy, raising the prices of everything as it touches. So the reason why it's a tax is because the government gets the newly created money first. They get to spend it at the old pre-inflation value. This is a transfer of wealth, aka a tax, because it's money going to the government. And the people who get the money first are the political class, or the firms that do business with the government, the bureaucrats, the politicians, the special interest groups. And the people who get it last are Joe Public, the working stiff, the independent businessman. So it really does benefit some segments of society and harm others. Inflation has many pernicious effects. It's also used to finance war. It's an indispensable component of militarism and imperialism, because if people were forced to pay the full price of the war up front, they would not want to. People are fine to cheer on a war of aggression, national pride. They don't really care. But if they're forced to pick up the tab, then they start having some questions, right? But inflation allows the government to basically put that war on layaway, and people still end up paying for it, but they don't realize how much they're paying. They're paying through the degradation of their savings. And what about a guy who's living off savings, or mostly off savings? He doesn't have an income. He's just got the money he saved from the hard work over the years, and he's getting robbed by the government. He's paying the bulk of this tax.
About something distributive, which might raise questions about politics and minimum wages and unions and so on and so on. Although, okay, Gustavo, I mean, I acknowledge that you have a point there, because Argentina does have a context of like runaway inflation. So that
150%, yeah,
that is true. But the question of how to reduce that, I don't think this guy really has an answer to that.
Stop printing money. It's not rocket science.
That's going to be satisfactory. I think he would just basically
actually just go on the dollar. I mean, they're already dollarized. They already have $200 billion. I mean, not that the dollar is the greatest currency in the world or anything, but apparently they can't find anybody in Argentina with the balls to constrain inflation. So it's going to be a heck of a lot better to have 2 or 3% inflation every year than the 40 or 50% they've averaged over the last 50 years.
We want to collapse the economy, which would affect everybody more negatively.
Por el impuesto inflacionario los beneficiaría muchísimo más.
Oh, is that it? Okay. Right. So I don't know. I don't know. I just thought it was like basically. So to sum up the argument of that, by the way, in case, because it all went by quite quickly, what he seems to be saying is a really, really weird version, an extreme version of something that economists sometimes call Say's law. Now, it has different interpretations.
Say's law is basically can be simplified to say supply of X constitutes demand for Y. Not supply creates demand, but supply of X constitutes demand for Y. And it's just proof against a glut of overproduction. This idea that you can just have too much goods on the market, and that's going to lead to some sort of crash. But it's not, because when people trade, what they're doing is trading production. More production's a good thing.
The most common interpretation is this idea that supply creates its own demand.
Yeah, that's the mischaracterization of Say's law that Keynes was infamous for. It's not true. It's more accurate to describe it as supply of X constitutes demand for Y.
It can't generally be a demand shortage. As long as things are produced, people will buy them, and we should reach full employment. And if we don't reach full employment, then prices and wages just need to fall in line with the scarcity of the real economy, right? And so that seems to be what he has in mind. But it is literally him saying, when he talks about general equilibrium effects, looking at all of the different markets, he's basically saying what I do with my money makes absolutely no difference whatsoever to what happens. The economy is always going to work, so it doesn't matter if I automate away a load of jobs.
That's actually true. Unironically, not ironically, like that is true. It really doesn't matter what anybody does in the market economy. It's still going to work just fine. We don't have to control people. They can pursue their own interests, and it's going to be okay.
And then, assuming I make money from that, which I may not do, it doesn't matter if I save it in a bank. It doesn't matter if I invest it myself. It doesn't matter if I consume it and spend it. It doesn't matter if I put it under a mattress. The economy is always going to function. Now, this is all.
I mean, technically, it's going to be better if you save it. I mean, if well, it depends what we're talking about, right? If we're talking about long-term economic growth, it's going to be better if you save it because that's more resources going into more production for later on. But yeah, basically, you spend the money on consumption. That's still creating jobs in the consumption sector, the service sector, or whatever. And the reason this is true is because interactions in the market economy are all mutually beneficial. So every road leads to Rome. It doesn't matter what you do, so long as you're engaging in a consensual trade, a mutually beneficial trade. There's basically, now if you destroyed real wealth, that would be something. Like if you just bought a car or stole a car and destroyed it, that would be. But in terms of like any sort of market activity that you can do, any sort of trade or exchange or production, that's always going to benefit somebody at least. It's never going to harm anybody, and that's the beauty of the market economy, is that all interactions are mutually beneficial, or I should say virtually all, because it's possible to make a mistake in judging whether a trade is going to benefit you, but it's extremely rare because each individual is an expert in determining whether a trade is going to benefit them or not. They've got a lifetime worth of experience you trying to satisfy the various ends with the various means.
Obviously absurd, right? If everybody just destroyed all of their money, then there would be a massive problem. There would be
Maybe if everybody did, although even then, I mean, we just get new money. It wouldn't be actually that bad. So what would happen in that case is, the most commonly desired commodity would become the new money. I mean, yeah, that would be a bit of a problem, but I mean, sure, if everybody devoted all their resources to consumption, like everything, that would also have some long-term problems. But that's not a realistic scenario, nor is everybody burning their cash. I mean, like, it doesn't really make sense to imagine that tomorrow everybody's going to wake up and in some mass hypnosis burn their cash. But even if they did, it wouldn't affect the total wealth of the economy. It would just make trade more difficult. Of course, there'd still be all the money electronically existing. Probably we'd start using other countries' money almost immediately. There'd be a massive demand at the border for foreign dollars. But yeah, this is a bizarre argument. Like the fact that a business owner can make multiple choices with their income and it's all going to be okay. How does that relate to some bizarre hypothetical where everybody burned their money?
a massive decline in employment. There would be a decline in the velocity of money, the rate at which money was circulating.
The velocity of money is actually irrelevant. Money's a medium of exchange, and it's always sufficient for those purposes, that is, to allow people to exchange. Let's imagine 10 individuals living on an island, and they're cut off from the world, and they've got some form of money, let's say gold coins. So one guy fishes, one guy farms, another guy gathers coconuts. They're all employed in productive activity, and they've got, say, 100 gold coins, and they use that to trade their goods with each other, okay? So does it matter how quickly those coins circulate through the economy? No, okay? Because all that really matters is how much production they do. How many coconuts he gathers, how long the one guy, the more fish he fishes, the more fish are going to be available, and also the cheaper the fish will be because they're perishable, right? So he's going to want to sell them before they go bad. But it's irrelevant how quickly the gold changes hands. That's not going to create any more wealth. The wealth is only created through the production, and that's true in the modern economy as well. No, I'm talking about in general, not this freak scenario where all the money was destroyed through a mass hypnosis.
This would be a huge, huge problem. And it's almost this bizarre...
He's trying to do reductio ad absurdum, but the reductio ad absurdum is only true if the relationship hasn't changed. So there's a very big difference between destroying some of the money supply and destroying the total money supply.
The economy exists in a certain form and has a certain level of consumption and investment and real GDP and employment apart from any of our decisions. It's just like self-correcting. It's really, really odd. And one of the things about this point of view, I think, is that although he didn't say this, knowing his politics, I'm confident in stating that he would think that if the government spent the money, it would destroy wealth somehow. So it's like, okay,
I'm certainly happy to take that position. Government spending is destructive of certainly, if not wealth, then utility, because when an individual spends their money on their own, they spend it on their highest ordered good, whatever brings them the most utility. Well, when the government spends money on people, or ostensibly on people, they just spend it on whatever the government's going to spend it on. They don't know what the people who they're spending the money on, what their value scales are, or what they most desire, and they don't care, even if they knew, which they don't, which they can't. So government spending is clearly going to lead to a massive loss in utility overall, as the people who are taxed now have a lower utility, and the people who the money is spent on, it's not getting spent on the highest utility and they would have. So in other words, the benefit of the spending is necessarily going to be less than the cost of the taxation in terms of utility. And not to mention, the whole process of taxation and spending is there's a ton of dead weight. There's a ton of, it's extremely expensive to operate the bureaucracy to do this. So there's a lot of wealth lost there as well. Government spending is absolutely destructive of wealth. It's inherently consumptive. I mean, you're literally you're stealing money from the productive private sector. You're taxing them, taking that wealth, and then transferring it to the political class, so the political class can spend it on consumption. So that's going to lead to, if you look at the unseen, which is all the reinvestment in the economy that the money would have been used for. Not all of it, clearly, but some of it would have been reinvested in the economy. Probably a lot, since even workers can be investors, and since the degree that taxes come from businessmen or investors, they're probably already at their ideal level of consumption anyway. So government spending, taxation and spending leads to overall substantial loss in utility, and less wealth is going to be created overall because of this process. And then C, there's going to be a chilling effect on the creation of wealth and on investment from any sort of high tax, anti-business environment, which is what you get with taxation and spending from the state. And the higher that is, the more people are going to be scared to invest and create a business, knowing that so much of their wealth is going to be occupied by dealing with regulations and paying taxes, complying with all these hoops and regulations, red tape. And sure, there's all sorts of fallacious economic theories that justify government spending, and governments love those theories because they say, hey, do whatever you want. But the reality is, yes, government spending is destructive of wealth.
I'm a private citizen, a private business owner. It doesn't matter what I do with my money, but if the government taxes it and they spend it on something then that necessarily like reduces employment, and that necessarily has a negative effect, which doesn't follow. Because if you think that no matter what you do with the money, the economy is going to self-correct, then you should think that even if the government intervenes directly and taxes and spends the money, that should have no effect. If the economy is that self-equilibrating, right?
The crucial difference here is that in the market economy, interactions are always mutually beneficial and consensual. So in the parlance of game theory, interactions are always win-win. Both parties agree to a transaction, both parties expect a benefit, and both parties are usually right. With the state taxing money, well, the taxing isn't consensual, and then the government bureaucrats or the politicians who are spending the money, it's not even theirs. So in the market economy, I don't have to spend my money. It's mine. I could choose to take a deal, or I could choose to walk away if it's not beneficial to me. But the politicians and the bureaucrats, they don't really care. They have to spend all this money every year. They want to spend as much as they possibly can because the politicians' spending is power. They get no real benefit from saving, from abstaining from spending. They want to spend as much as possible. It's not their money. They don't get to keep the money if they don't spend it. It would go back to the taxpayer or whatever. But if they accrue a benefit from spending money, say clout from the people they spend the money on, then they want to spend as much as possible, and they're not particularly careful about how they do it. That's why there's a real moral hazard with government spending and with taxes in the first place. Say the government were to spend the money on something horrible and evil, like dropping bombs on innocent brown people in the Middle East. Well, nobody is going to go door to door and ask and try to raise money for the Let's Bomb the Innocent Brown People Fund. Okay, that would not fly. Nobody's going to make a donation to that organization. No one would choose to voluntarily support it. But the problem with taxation is that because the money's collected through coercion, the government doesn't have to rely on your consent for any purchase. You have to send them your money, and they'll do with it whatever they damn well please, including, yes, dropping bombs on innocent brown people in the Middle East. And while war, especially wars of aggression against poor nations, which tend to be the cases with wars, power doesn't confront power. Power likes to confront the powerless, right? Like, Great Britain didn't bomb France, they bombed Iraq, because they knew that they wouldn't strike back. So while war is the most obvious of these examples, there's a lot of things the government does that nobody would ever voluntarily pay for. And that's the moral hazard of taxation.